The first cold wind of October swept across the frozen tundra when people noticed something strange on the edge of the remote settlement. While every other settler raced to finish simple four-wall cabins before the brutal Arctic winter crushed the valley, one quiet Norwegian immigrant was still measuring angles in the snow-dusted ground. He was drawing shapes no one had ever seen in this frozen frontier. Not a square, not a rectangle, an octagon. By the third week of October, the others had already raised their walls and started stacking firewood. But that man, Lars Eriksson, kept working with the calm focus of someone who knew something the others did not. He cut logs with careful precision. He shaped clean edges with his broad axe. He made 8 sides, each one the same length, each angle exact. His neighbors shook their heads every time they passed by. "He's building a church," one man joked. "He'll freeze to death before Christmas," another said. 8 sides won't stand up to real blizzards. They laughed while they hammered mud into their corners. They laughed while they slapped roofs on their cabins. They laughed because winter was coming fast. And to them, Lars looked like a man wasting time he didn't have. But Lars had survived 30 brutal Norwegian winters. He had watched storms swallow whole villages. He had slept in mountain homes built by men who understood wind better than maps. And tucked inside his leather satchel was a small worn book that he had carried across the ocean. Orson Fowler's A Home for All. The book claimed an 8-sided cabin stayed warmer, held more space, used less wall material, and lost less heat than any four-corner house ever could. So while the others rushed, Lars studied the land. He watched where the pale sun rose. He watched where the wind hit hardest. He dug a foundation deeper than anyone thought necessary and lifted it with stone to keep permafrost and cold moisture out. It took him weeks longer than anyone else, and with each day the doubt around him grew. Ivan Petrov, a burly Russian trapper with a half-built cabin behind him, pointed and laughed whenever passers-by stopped. "All those angles," he said. "Man solving problems nobody has." Nikolai Volkov, another settler, shook his head each time he walked by. "By the time that fool finishes, the rest of us will be warmed by the fire." Even Anna Kuznetsova, a widow who respected hard work more than anyone, whispered to the other women that maybe the Norwegian had taken on more than any man could finish before the snows. But Lars did not break his pace. He cut each 12-inch thick log by hand. He flattened each edge so tight that almost no chinking was needed. And while the others slapped their cabins together with 6-inch pine, Lars built double walls, a thick outer wall, a smaller inner wall, and a 4-inch space between them packed tight with sawdust, clay, and chopped moss. Insulation no one else thought about, the kind his grandfather had taught him to make. By late October, the other cabin stood finished. Fires burned, walls dried, tools were cleaned and stored for the season. Lars still worked alone inside his half-built frame, fitting each angled corner with care. When the others relaxed, Lars lifted roof beams under lantern light, shaping an 8-sided roof that needed perfect precision. Then the first snow came early. On November 15th, soft flakes at dawn became a whiteout by afternoon. 8 inches fell before sunset. Temperatures dropped fast, and by nightfall, the whole settlement felt the bite of a winter they were not prepared to meet. Inside his cabin, Petrov fed logs into a stone fireplace that never seemed warm enough. The wind found every tiny gap in the corners. Volkov's walls iced over by morning, and he burned almost all his firewood just to keep water from freezing. Anna Kuznetsova wrapped herself in blanket after blanket and still woke up with frost on her water bucket. For the first time, the settlers wondered if this winter would be worse than they had ever seen. But in the middle of that storm, Lars finished his last roof beam. His octagon stood strong, tight, sealed, and warm. Snow slid off his angled roof instead of piling heavy. The wind hit his walls and broke apart instead of pushing through. The double-layered logs trapped warm air inside, and the central fireplace sent heat evenly through the room, without losing a single degree to an exterior wall. By the third night of the storm, when temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, the truth became impossible to ignore. The rectangular cabins hovered near freezing inside. People gathered around fires just to keep their hands from stiffening. Smoke rose from every chimney except one, Lars's chimney. His fire burned so efficiently that he did not need to keep it roaring. A bed of glowing coals kept his entire octagon at a steady, comfortable 20 degrees, fully 15 degrees warmer than every home in the settlement, while the others shivered through the coldest week of their lives. Lars sat inside reading by lamplight, warm enough to work without gloves. And outside, the neighbors, who had spent months laughing, suddenly found themselves staring at the only cabin in the Alaskan wilderness that winter had not beaten. By the third week of the cold snap, the difference between Lars's octagon and the rectangular cabins could no longer be explained away. Every other settler was fighting the same losing battle. Fires roared morning and night, yet cold drafts crawled through every corner. The sharp angles of their cabins created pockets where heat never reached. The wind slipped through any gap it could find. Even the strongest logs shrank in the dry cold, opening cracks no one had noticed in autumn. Ivan Petrov was the first to understand how serious the situation had become. His family had planned carefully for winter, but his woodpile was shrinking at a dangerous pace. He burned half a cord in 1 week alone, far more than he expected. Even with flames reaching up the chimney, the far side of his cabin felt colder than outside air on a fall morning. His children slept with numb fingers despite being wrapped in blankets near the fire. On the other side of the settlement, things were worse for Nikolai Volkov. He had built his cabin fast and light, thinking he would reinforce it in the spring. Now frost covered his walls from floor to ceiling. His breath hung in the air like smoke, and water froze solid overnight, even with the fire going. He had not slept well in days, feeding logs into flames every hour just to stay alive. Anna Kuznetsova faced an even harder truth. She had built her cabin alone after losing her husband. Her logs were thin, because they were the only ones she could lift. Her walls leaked cold air from every direction. The clay chinking froze and cracked. By the second night below zero, she could no longer warm her hands, even while sitting beside her fire. Each settler found themselves staring at the same problem. Their homes were failing, and each time they stepped outside to gather wood, they saw it. The one cabin standing against the storm, untouched by frost. Lars's Octagon. On December 3rd, just after sunrise, Petrov saw something that made him stop splitting wood altogether. There was no smoke rising from the Norwegian's chimney. Not a curl, not even a thin line. For a moment, he feared the worst, thinking the man had frozen during the night. Petrov pushed through the wind and knocked on the door. Lars opened it, wearing nothing but a wool shirt, looking as warm and calm as if it were spring. The air that drifted out felt like stepping into another world. Petrov stood in silence, too stunned to speak. "Your fire," Petrov finally said. "Is it out?" "Burning low," Lars answered. "Do not need much now." Petrov stepped inside, expecting to see a roaring blaze. Instead, he found only a bed of glowing coals. Yet, the room felt warmer than his own cabin with a full fire. The heat was even with no cold corners. The walls held like a pot-holed soup. As the day went on, others came to see the same miracle. Volkov arrived first, carrying a hatchet and shame in equal measure. "I'm near out of wood," he admitted. "I haven't slept more than an hour at a time." When he walked inside, he stopped mid-step. "Sweet Lord," he whispered, unwinding the scarf from his face. "It feels like a different season." Later that evening, Anna Kuznetsova came to the door with trembling hands. Her own cabin had fallen below zero inside. She had burned every scrap she owned, including furniture, to stay alive. The moment she entered the Octagon, her eyes filled with tears. That warm air wrapped around her like a blanket. She thought she might never feel again. "I didn't know a room could feel like this," she said quietly. Lars asked for nothing in return. He simply made room near the walls for bedding and belongings. Guests could move around in the Octagon without bumping into cold air pockets, because the heat traveled in one smooth circle around the room. Meanwhile, the settlers' abandoned cabin sat in the dark, freezing inside even when fires burned. Corners trapped cold air. Walls leaked warmth faster than fires could replace it. The fireplaces built against outer walls pulled heat straight outside. Winter had exposed every weakness. Inside the Octagon, it was the opposite. No corners, no drafts, no wasted heat. The thick insulated walls held warmth through the night. Yet the central fireplace heated the whole room evenly. The angled roof shed snow before it could build weight. For the first time in their lives, the settlers understood that shape alone could decide survival. By mid-December, the Octagon had turned into a shelter for everyone who needed it. Lars shared what he could, but the truth was simple. He did not need much. His design was working so well that even with 7 people inside, he burned less wood than a single family needed in a rectangular cabin. That night, as wind pounded the tundra and the temperature fell past 40 below, the group gathered around Lars's central fireplace in steady, even warmth. Outside, the storm howled. Inside the Octagon, it felt like the only safe place in the world. For the first time all winter, they slept without fear. As the brutal winter dragged on, the truth became impossible to ignore. The settlers' old ideas about cabin building were gone. The only structure that stood against the storm without failing was the one they had mocked for months. The Octagon was no longer a curiosity. It was a lifeline. By December 15th, the settlement had changed. Lars's warm Octagon became the heart of the community. Every night, the wind screamed outside, rattling the windows of abandoned rectangular cabins. But inside the 8-sided home, the air stayed steady and warm. 7 adults worked, talked, and shared meals under the soft glow of lamplight. Even the local carpenter, Sergei Ivanov, arrived one morning carrying his tool bag. His own cabin, built with perfect joints and clean lines, had still failed against the deep cold. The corners trapped freezing air. The walls leaked heat. The fireplace pushed warmth straight outside through the stone. Ivanov had watched his wood piles shrink at a frightening pace. He stepped into the Octagon, closed the door behind him, and stood in silence. This, he finally said, touching the warm inner wall, is the kind of building that saves lives. From that day on, Ivanov studied every inch of the structure. He measured angles. He checked the roof pitch. He tapped the walls to hear how the packed insulation held firm. He spent long evenings asking Lars questions, filling page after page his notebook. "How did you learn this?" he asked one night. "My father," Lars said, "and his father before him. Some things are tested by time." The others listened closely. They had felt their hopes slipping away when the cold reached its worst. But now they saw a path forward. As the winter deepened, the Octagon proved its strength again and again. Snow piled up outside to nearly 2 feet. Yet no frost formed on the inside walls. The wind shifted directions, but no draft touched the room. At night, the fire could burn down the coals, and still the interior stayed warmer than any other home in the settlement. Weeks earlier, they had laughed at Lars. Now, they trusted him with their survival. By the time the first warm Chinook winds arrived in March, the settlement looked nothing like it had before winter. The rectangular cabins stood empty. Some leaned, some sagged. Some had split at the corners where the cold had forced the logs apart. Most were only useful now for salvaged lumber. But the Octagon stood solid, the roof tight, the walls warm, the door straight. Even after the coldest months on record, it looked ready for another storm. Sergei Ivanov did not wait for spring. Before the snow melted, he began laying the foundation for his own Octagon, 10 sides instead of 8, built with the same double-wall construction. Petrov helped him cut angled logs. Volkov hauled stones for the raised foundation. Even Anna Kuznetsova joined them, planning a smaller hexagon home she could manage on her own. That summer, 5 new homes took shape around the old settlement. 3 were octagons. 2 were hexagons. Everyone followed the principles Lars had proven during the winter. Central fireplace, double walls with packed insulation, a shape that lost no heat to wasted corners, and a roof designed to shed snow instead of holding it. Word spread fast. Settlers from nearby outposts came to see the design that had kept 7 people warm during a winter that had killed families elsewhere. Ivanov traveled with his tools, teaching others how to build octagons in camps as far as the Yukon. By the early years that followed, octagon cabins had become common across the region. Sawmills cut angled beams on request. Officials wrote pamphlets encouraging new arrivals to consider the design. The idea had started with a single Norwegian carpenter who trusted what he knew, even when no one else believed him. And Lars, he stayed right where he was. His Octagon remained a warmest home for miles, a building that carried the story of a winter when the wind nearly won, but lost to one man's patience, knowledge, and stubborn determination. Years later, people would still point to that 8-sided cabin and say, "That's where it changed. That's when we stopped building for speed and started building for survival." The neighbors had laughed at the man who built an Octagon, but they stopped laughing the moment winter came. The shape they mocked had saved their lives.